Hello everyone, welcome to True Crime Cases. Today, we're diving into a chilling case where a psychological re-examination led to a breakthrough in the investigation 4 years later. The case of Kristen Trickle is particularly complex and unique. It is considered the first instance of psychological exhumation in forensic history, undertaken to uncover the motivations and thought processes of a young woman who suddenly decided to end her life. No one believed that a cheerful, devout Christian with big plans for the future would abruptly end her life without any apparent reason. The forensic pathologist's conclusion supported the prevailing theory, but an experienced psychologist uncovered the truth. The main challenge was the time that had passed since the tragedy. Years had gone by, but ultimately, this did not prevent the conviction of the criminal who thought he had escaped justice. The love story of Kristen and Colby Trickle began with Kristen, née Reese, who was born on August 14, 1993, in a small town in southeastern Nebraska. Her childhood was far from carefree and untroubled. Her biological mother left the family when Kristen was not even 3 years old, abandoning her husband and child for another man. She moved to California and never again showed any interest in her daughter's fate. Kristen's father, James, raised his daughter on his own, doing everything possible to ensure she lacked for nothing. However, he suffered from a severe illness that progressively worsened, and when Kristen turned 16, her father passed away. With no other close relatives, she faced the possibility of being sent to a shelter until she came of age. At this time, an aunt and uncle on her father's side, who lived in the neighboring state of Kansas, stepped in. Although the couple was already raising 3 children of their own, they expressed a willingness to take in their orphaned niece and did everything possible to ensure she had a comfortable and happy life. Soon, the young girl moved into her relative's home. In her new family, Kristen never felt like an outsider. On the contrary, her aunt and uncle treated her just like their own children, surrounding her with love and care. Kristen excelled in school, attended art studio classes, helped her family with household tasks, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian because she loved animals dearly. Relatives and friends described her as compassionate, kind, friendly, and very sweet. She never despaired, confidently pursued her goals, and energized everyone around her with her optimism. The Reese family was religious, so they regularly attended church on Sundays. It was there that 18-year-old Kristen met a young man named Colby. He was an aspiring musician, performing with a band that played music during sermons and services. Having recently turned 18, he was talented and dreamed of building a successful music career in the future. The young people quickly formed a friendship, which soon blossomed into a romantic relationship. Colby was skilled on the guitar and wrote his own songs, which he dedicated to his beloved, capturing her heart. He was open, sociable, cheerful, and easily made friends, often becoming the life of any gathering. After finishing high school, he developed a serious interest in military service and joined the Army. By the age of 18, he had signed several contracts and began his service in the U.S. Armed Forces. Over the next 3 years, he built a respectable military career. During this time, he stayed in touch with Kristen, frequently calling and corresponding with her. At the age of 21, Colby unexpectedly entered the reserves and returned home to propose to his sweetheart, who joyfully accepted. The couple married in April 2014. The newlyweds settled in a small town called Hays in Kansas, where Colby finished college and pursued a music career, albeit not very successfully. He performed at small parties and local events, playing cover versions of well-known hits. The couple had 2 dogs, which they adored, and many considered their marriage quite happy. However, 5 years into their marriage, a terrible tragedy occurred on Halloween Eve, October 31st, 2019. Around 4 in the morning, a distressed call was made to Emergency Services Dispatch. The caller, a man who identified himself as Colby Trickle, reported that his wife, Kristen, had shot herself in the head with a revolver kept in their home. A medical team promptly arrived at the scene, accompanied by a nearby police patrol car. At the front door, they encountered a young man who allowed the officers inside but remained outside himself. Trickle seemed relatively composed, considering the seriousness of the situation. When the officers entered the bedroom, they discovered a woman lying on the bed amidst a pool of her own blood. A large revolver lay on her abdomen, with a gunshot wound visible on her chin, indicating she had likely already passed away. However, unexpectedly, the victim moved her hand, and an officer discovered a weak pulse and signs of breathing. Kristen was then carefully moved to an adjacent room where she could be positioned on the floor for resuscitation efforts. Unfortunately, despite all efforts, Kristen had passed away by the time the ambulance arrived, and the medical team could only confirm her death. Sergeant Brandt went outside and informed Colby of his wife's passing. Colby repeatedly asked for confirmation, visibly upset, and upon receiving it, he began to cry. His tears seemed genuine, though his behavior appeared somewhat inconsolable. Just minutes before Sergeant Brandt's arrival, Colby had been casually discussing video games with other patrol officers. Initially, it appeared that Kristen had chosen to end her life voluntarily. However, upon examining the scene, experienced detectives immediately suspected foul play. It was Halloween Eve, and it appeared that Kristen had been actively preparing for the celebration. On her bedroom's vanity, there were handmade costume decorations she had prepared, and in the kitchen, themed treats for children were set out in bowls, lollipop bats, ghosts, gummy worms, and more. The chosen method of ending her life was very unusual and atypical for her, as was the scene itself. Initially found nearly undressed, women generally want to look presentable even in death, concerned about how they will be found. Secondly, a gunshot to the head is not a typically chosen method, as many are concerned about disfiguration. Kristen's face was so badly damaged that she had to be buried in a closed casket. The third and most significant oddity was the weapon itself. The revolver was too large and cumbersome for such a petite and fragile woman. It would have been awkward for her to hold, and it's unlikely she could have twisted her arm to shoot herself in the chin. Moreover, the position of the weapon puzzled the officer. It lay in the woman's stomach, pointing sideways. However, he had briefly considered ending his own life, holding the revolver to his temple. He then abandoned the idea and decided to call emergency services in hopes of saving his beloved. While law enforcement continued their work at the scene, the woman's mobile phone, lying in a nightstand, unexpectedly rang with an alarm. It turned out that the deceased had plans for the morning, setting the alarm not to be late. However, she seemingly changed her mind during the night and decided to end her life. This appeared highly suspicious, leading detectives to suspect they were dealing with a carefully staged scene. The widower, now the main suspect, was scheduled for questioning and interrogation regarding Colby's account. The man willingly agreed to go to the police station to give his statement. He appeared upset but not devastated, remaining calm and composed. He explained that on that evening, his wife Kristen had returned from her job at Walmart, where she worked as a manager and was expecting a promotion to senior manager. They had dinner together, played video games, and then Colby went to bed early feeling unwell, while Kristen went to the kitchen to finish cleaning and setting out sweets for the holiday. In the middle of the night, Colby was jolted awake by a sudden loud bang. For a few seconds, he was disoriented, with his ears ringing and unable to see anything in the darkness. Once he turned on the light, he found his wife lying motionless beside him, blood pouring from her head. He attempted to revive her but quickly realized it was futile. He briefly considered using the revolver on himself, but instead placed it back beside her, called emergency services, and went outside to meet the police. The sequence and nature of his actions raised many questions. For instance, why he placed the weapon on the woman's abdomen instead of discarding it on the floor, the bed. It was also unclear why he chose to wait outside for the police and medics if he believed his wife might still be saved. Typically, in such situations, people attempt to perform life-saving measures or apply pressure to the wound to stop the bleeding. The former serviceman did not approach his wife again, explaining that he was in shock. Meanwhile, a police officer attempted to provide first aid before the medics arrived. Colby did not intervene or inquire about the situation. Instead, he engaged in casual conversation outside with a patrol officer about music and video games. Upon learning that Kristen was no longer alive, he managed to squeeze out a few tears but quickly regained his composure. At the station, Colby was asked the standard question about life insurance on the deceased, to which he responded negatively. He did mention, however, that he was entitled to some minor payouts from the armed forces where he had served. Incidentally, Trickle began to boast about his accomplishments, mentioning his service in intelligence and involvement in special operations around the world. His words sounded convincing initially, but it soon became clear that almost none of what he said was true. When asked why he thought his wife might have taken such a desperate step, he claimed she had suffered from prolonged depression since a young age, exacerbated by the events of her childhood and adolescence. He mentioned her mother's betrayal, her father's death, and her upbringing in her uncle and aunt's home, whom Kristen had not known before. The widower's words again sounded convincing, and he spoke confidently and calmly. However, experienced investigators suspected that he might be lying and had possibly planted his statements in advance. Yet, at that moment, they lacked concrete evidence to charge him with any wrongdoing. So Mr. Trickle had to be released. Kristen's family's perspective was clear. When Kristen's uncle, aunt, and siblings were informed of the tragedy, they immediately traveled nearly 500 miles from their city to Hayes to speak with the police and prepare for the funeral. Unanimously, they vehemently denied the possibility that she could have willingly ended her life, citing her deep religious faith, regular church attendance, and her belief that such an act was a sin. Additionally, according to her family, Kristen was a life-loving optimist with ambitious future plans. Specifically, Kristen wanted to open a shelter for homeless animals and had already identified a suitable property with a large plot of land. This intention was soon verified when detectives confirmed she had been actively negotiating to rent the property. Moreover, Kristen was anticipating a promotion at work, a position she was proud of. She was preparing her costume and candies for Halloween and had promised to visit her sister for her birthday in mid-November. Her relatives also insisted that she had never suffered from depression, had no mental disorders, or harmful habits. Another crucial point they stressed was that she would never recklessly abandon her beloved dogs. During discussions with the police, the uncle and aunt suggested that Colby might have callously manipulated the situation, making it appear as though Kristen had voluntarily ended her life. They described her husband as cruel and domineering, attempting to control every aspect of her interactions, deciding whom she could communicate with. He would become enraged if Kristen did not respond to his calls or messages immediately. He also forbade her from speaking with her relatives, and she would secretly call them, as visits were rare due to her husband's restrictions. During her last visit, she confided that she could no longer tolerate such treatment, had discussed it with her husband, and warned that if things did not improve, they would have to separate. Autopsy results and forensic expert conclusions were pivotal in the investigation. Following discussions with both the widower and the deceased's relatives, detectives believed that the forensic examination would be decisive. The examination revealed a single entry wound from a bullet located on the chin. The shot had been fired while the woman was lying on her back, with the gun barrel pressed closely to her head. It was theoretically possible that she could have inflicted the wound herself, although it would have been extremely difficult for her to do so. There were no signs of struggle or resistance on Kristen's body. However, upon learning from relatives about Colby's controlling behavior, detectives insisted on an additional examination for any signs of bruises, abrasions, scratches, or other injuries at various stages of healing. They hypothesized that if the former serviceman had been occasionally violent towards his wife, there would inevitably be some evidence of it. However, the investigation yielded disappointment as no internal or external injuries were found besides the gunshot wound. As the investigation delved deeper into Colby's background, it became apparent that he was a pathological liar. He lied so frequently and convincingly that he often appeared to believe his own fabrications. The truth emerged that he had never been in any conflict zones or involved in intelligence operations, despite persuading everyone during questioning that he was truthful. Colby had misled those around him about having a thriving music career and higher earnings. In reality, Kristen had been the primary breadwinner for their family, working tirelessly for several years. On the other hand, Colby scraped by with occasional gigs during holidays, spending the rest of his time playing video games. Despite his talent, he lacked persistence, patience, and was hindered by laziness. Furthermore, the police had a warrant to seize and examine gadgets owned by the couple, and this inspection yielded intriguing results. The deceased's phone calendar was filled with scheduled activities ranging from haircuts to meetings with a real estate agent. Meanwhile, Colby's messages revealed that he had been openly flirting with another woman, even exchanging messages while at the police station on a laptop in the living room. A search history that had been deleted was recovered, showing that shortly before the tragedy, there were queries about the payout amount for a life insurance policy in the event of death. This last aspect particularly interested the authorities, confirming that Colby had once again been dishonest. 2 insurance policies had been taken out on his wife, with him listed as the beneficiary in the event of her death. These included military spouse insurance as well as a standard life insurance policy. The amounts involved were significant, contrary to what the man had claimed. He had even calculated exactly what payouts he would be entitled to as the fortunate widower. Despite numerous inconsistencies in the case and direct allegations from the deceased relatives against Colby, the decision ultimately hinged on the forensic expert's report. The document stated that there were no signs of violence on the body except for a single gunshot wound, indicating it was highly likely that the deceased had voluntarily ended her life. Subsequently, the case was closed and archived. By that time, the widower had already received the payouts due to him from a special insurance for U.S. Armed Forces spouses. He received nearly $50,000 from this policy and over $100,000 from the life insurance policy. On the very day the money was deposited into his account, he ordered a life-sized realistic doll for intimate pleasures from an online store. He also purchased a new gaming console, electric guitar, and expensive musical equipment, and began spending the rest on clothes and entertainment, frequenting bars and restaurants nearly every evening. Colby was enjoying life, sparing no expense for himself, and genuinely believed that the story was over with no evidence against him and thus no potential charges. He lived happily for about 2 years until a pivotal event occurred. In the summer of 2021, a new prosecutor took over the case. The detectives handling the Trickle case appealed to the newly appointed district prosecutor for help, requesting permission to reopen the investigation. They asserted they had little doubt that the widower had orchestrated his wife's demise to make it appear as though she had voluntarily taken her own life. As evidence, they presented all the peculiarities and discrepancies, pointed to the restored browser history, and highlighted the suspect's unusual behavior and clear motive. After reviewing the case materials, the prosecutor authorized the reopening of the case, and in July 2021, Trickle was finally taken into custody. He was charged with first-degree premeditated homicide and intentionally misleading the investigation. During his arrest, he remained calm and promptly contacted his lawyers, who began working on his defense immediately. Colby's defense relied on the forensic pathologist's findings and argued that Kristen had suffered from chronic depression for many years, suggesting her tragic demise was inevitable. Meanwhile, his lawyers attempted to portray their client as a loving and caring husband, a valorous serviceman, and a devout individual. The investigation faced a potential dead end as it relied heavily on the same medical conclusions. Therefore, the prosecution took an unprecedented step by bringing in experienced specialists to create a psychological profile of the deceased and analyze her emotional state just before the tragedy. This unconventional method was termed a psychological autopsy or psychological exhumation. The psychiatrists conducted extensive work analyzing data from Kristen's mobile phone. Her social media posts, her most recent photos, and interviews with her relatives, friends, and colleagues were all analyzed. Gathering and assessing this information took months, but the experts' conclusion was unequivocal. Kristen could not have intended to end her life, given her short-term and long-term plans. The trial and verdict in this complex case began in September 2023, nearly 4 years after the tragedy. When Colby was questioned about the insurance inquiries on his computer, he claimed they were likely to be his wife who wanted to know the payout amount. When asked about the life-size doll for intimate pleasures that he purchased even before his late wife was buried, He responded that he couldn't sleep alone and needed someone to hold. This thorough investigation took time, but its findings left not out that Kristen had not intended to end her life. And on November 20th, 2023, the jury unanimously found Colby guilty on all charges, sentencing him to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole no earlier than 50 years. Throughout the trial, Colby maintained his innocence and never admitted guilt, despite all appeals being ultimately rejected. An unusual aspect of this case is that corrections to the cause of death were never made in the medical report. Thank you for watching, everyone. Subscribe to my channel for more compelling stories ahead.